I can see a lot of you are familiar with VR design and development, and I think a lot of people think of VR as this futuristic thing. I'm going to be looking at it a little bit in terms of the past, and to do that, I'm going to take you on a little trip back to the 90s. So, I don't know if you guys remember GeoCities. Yeah. But this talk is going to make a lot more sense. If you remember things like blink tags and scrolling marquees and animated GIFs everywhere, not ironically, it was pretty cringy. Well, right now I think that VR design and development is kind of in a GeoCities moment. So the point of a lot of that stuff was to draw the user's attention to a feature that the developer wanted them to engage with. And that was largely resolved with standardization. So eventually, you had things like clean websites. And you had things like the login UI, always in the upper right-hand corner. And the presentation started getting standardized, which reduced the need for the developers to engage in some of these cheesy attraction techniques. In VR, we don't have those standards yet. So I'm seeing a lot of gimmicky, over-complex designs, including in my own body of work, which I'll talk about a little bit today. And we're learning from them. So if you remember guest books, where did guest books go? Those eventually became comments, and those became Reddit, they became Facebook, or those under construction animated tractor GIFs, those became beta tags. They became move fast and break things. They became, that's just how the internet works. So in VR, we're also generating this pool of features right now that we're going to draw the standards from. And those are going to be the backbones of an elegant VR 2.0. We're just not quite there yet. I'd say at least 80% of my playtesters when I'm showing my VR games are what I call VRgens. They've never tried VR before. And so not only do you have to tutorialize your game that you're showing them, you also have to tutorialize the platform. And that's a lot of work. And that's because there's this lack of established relationship between the player and the medium. It's not like on console, you have Xbox where the A button is always action, the B button is always back, or on PC, space is fire or jump. In VR, we don't have those. And moreover, the input systems for the VR headsets that are coming out right now are coming from a fragmented set of companies. So there's really no standardization yet. So if the player doesn't know how to interact with the game, you have to tutorialize everything. The problem is that tutorials are largely visual. So how do you tutorialize something when the player can be looking in any direction? Because in VR, you have 360 degrees of visual freedom. So if you are trying to present something over here, and they're looking over there, how do you get them to turn around? And you can't pan the camera, because I've seen some of the games you are showing. You guys are probably aware, if you can't pan the camera, that's probably the quickest way you can make your player sick. But there's some visual tricks that I've seen developers engage in service of intentional manipulation. So one of the tricks in my game is I will do a particle effect. So I draw this star, and it spawns in front of the player where their current gaze is, and it draws their eye in the direction I want them to move. It's cool, it works most of the time. It doesn't work for everyone. There's another trick that I came up with, which is sort of this aurora borealis effect that's on the periphery of their vision. So if I want to draw their attention here, I'll sort of tease it along. And the problem with this one is it's really sort of rigid in that you're drawing them in an orthogonal direction. So that sort of evolved into this other thing I call the Vegas dots. So a lot of VR is experimentation right now. This is more of a radially emanating thing that literally draws from me being in Las Vegas, seeing those blinking linear marquees that guide your eye in a direction, and using that as a trick to pull the user's attention. Another trick you can do is you can use NPCs, non-playable characters. If you have an NPC that makes eye contact with the first-person camera, and the NPC then looks in a different direction, the player will naturally follow the gaze. But the problem is, what if the player's not looking at the NPC already? So typically NPCs are bipedal, and if you want to have that NPC come in front of the player's camera, you might need to move them quicker than they would necessarily animate, which can create a scaling effect. One thing that I did to kind of get around this is I made this NPC that's basically a genie lamp, and it just flies around and it scoots around. It's kind of magical, so I can get away with more breaking the rules. And these tricks are great. You know, you'll fix the problem of attentional manipulation for a lot of the players. But the problem is, just like in the 90s on the web, the more and more you add of these, the more messy it can get. So getting back to GeoCities, this was pretty common. You know, you had your spinning new animations, you had your spinning hit counters, everything was moving, and it was just kind of a mess. So I see that when people start to do VR design and development, they really want to make this. Everyone wants to make Minority Report. And what they really end up making is more akin to this. Jesse's skiing page, circa 1997. And the reason for that is that no one knows how to interact with this. This was made for a movie. They didn't have to have a working UI. And so you might start with this, do a play test. You realize you need to do a trick to help people along with understanding the interaction paradigm. And you'll add something, it'll work for some people, you'll do another play test, add something else, until you get to be in this sort of predicament with this big mess. One other thing that was this unforgettable, most cringy feature of 90s web development was the blink tag. We all know it and hate it. And that wasn't just about attentional manipulation. You had other tools at your disposal with text, such as font, weight, and layout to draw attention. I would argue that people abuse the heck out of this feature purely for the novelty of it. And I'm seeing that in VR, which brings me to Jeff Goldblum from Jurassic Park. This great quote applies to VR more than anything else. You were so preoccupied with whether or not you could, you didn't stop to think if you should. I'm seeing this all over VR. So one other thing that people abused back in the 90s was sys-tray privileges. So if you guys remember, you guys probably don't remember ICQ, but people had the capability to make things blink. They had notification badges that were animated, and it just became this little light switch brave down in the lower right-hand corner before Microsoft put the kibosh on that. So Microsoft put the kibosh on that just to clean things up, and so we need to do that with VR too. So speaking of just because you can, I am totally guilty of this. I've been doing VR design and development for about a year now, and I approached it with what can I do in VR that I can't do other places. So one of the first things I did was I put my heads-up display, literally heads up, I put my UI in the sky. And I thought, that's really cool. I've never been able to use this real estate before for a user interface. And it was really cool. It was kind of this magical thing when people discovered it. I had this glittering dendritic structure that would grow out in the sky that mapped, it was literally your mini-map, and it mapped onto this procedurally generated labyrinth that you're exploring on this flying carpet. And then I had my inventory of loot that had been collected was represented by constellations. So literally, if you wanted to grab your crossbow that you had found, you would just look at the crossbow constellation that you had got. It was cool, but it was pretty problematic. Problems were twofold. For one, it's really uncomfortable to have your user looking up at this angle with the frequency you would want to access a HUD. And the other thing is it's just not expected. So people, once they find an item in your game, they're really not expecting to go and look at the sky to retrieve that item. What they're expecting in this flying carpet game is that they're going to look at their carpet. So it's pretty beneficial to just meet people where their expectations are, especially in this new medium where people don't know how to interact with it. So I find that it's really important to know when to abandon an idea. You might be in love with it, but sorry, this is kind of screwed up. You might be in love with an idea, but if you find yourself throwing more and more tutorials at it, more and more tricks, it might be time to just move on and let it go. You don't have to wholesale throw away your cool innovations. So what I ended up doing was I reworked this constellation system to be more of an almanac a la Spelunky. Everything you found, you can sort of check it out in the sky, it's sort of your progress meter, but it's not gating. You don't have to interact with it in order to move forward in the game. And so what I'm getting at is VR design and development is not particularly difficult, What's difficult is making an experience that people are going to have fun with and return to over and over. It's pretty expensive R&D-wise because you are going to find that a lot of your trials don't work out. And I would say I have to spend at least 50% of my design energy designing for comfort and performance. I don't have the luxury of designing purely for game mechanics like I might if I was designing for a console game or a PC game. And this is not optional because there's a lot of real issues. So one of them is motion sickness. You can't simply port a VR game from a game that already exists. You have to make something original and something that plays with the constraints of VR nicely. So one of those constraints is motion sickness, and that really dictates you can't pan the camera around. You can't have any kind of curvilinear motion. Everything has to be this sort of like rigid Soviet linear motion. You have to keep your experiences kind of short. We're just not there tech-wise to have the processing that will result in the highest frame rates, the highest refresh rates that are going to lend to the most comfortable experiences. So I'm giving you a lot of rules not to break, but I do hope that you guys are the people who break them. They're just not things that we know how to break the rules successfully right now. One team, I don't know if you guys have seen Coloss, it's a VR experience, and they actually did a successful camera pan because they have a highly stylized game, and they were able to remove a lot of the visual elements in a scene before panning the camera, and that reduced the number of, like, the sort of pixel delta that was happening, and so you don't get sick. But it takes a lot more research to figure out how to break these rules successfully. Right now, the technology we're working with is you're on the bleeding edge of it for VR, and that technology is evolving at a rapid clip. The SDKs that you're integrating are incomplete. Features are rolling out right now. Just to give you a sense of the pace, I did the Oculus VR Jam this year, and within a 1 month jam, there were 5 different versions of the Oculus SDK. So it can feel really impossible to keep up. And even just on one device, you can have complex configurations because you might be dealing with multiple OSs if you're doing mobile VR with the gear, or you might have multiple chipsets depending on where your gear was manufactured in the world. And the manufacturer priority for these pieces of hardware is not VR. So a lot of this is mobile companies, graphics cards. The market's not there yet for VR to really be pushing on them, making this the most optimal experience. So because of this, there's all these hardware limitations that you really have to work around with your VR design right now. So just to give you a sense of one of the problems, in mobile VR design and development, you're dealing with some of the highest resolution screens in the world. But you're also tasked with double drawing all of your geometry because you're making a stereoscopic 3D game, presumably. And you have to maintain an impeccable frame rate. It has to be minimum 60 FPS, but ideally more, at least 90 FPS for a comfortable experience. But you're doing all of that with a phone processing power. It's a really, really tall order. And so what I'm finding is that you want to come up with solutions that will play with this ridiculous tall order. So one thing you can do is manage your aesthetic. You can come up with an aesthetic that is not going to be as taxing. So on mobile, you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of verts available to you, and that might sound like a lot, but it's not compared to tens of millions you might have at your disposal if you're doing PC and console development. So you want to come up with a look that will complement that constraint. You're also going to have issues with raster operations, and anti-aliasing is a big one. Phones are traditionally not very good at handling these raster operations, and you're going to get this stair-step effect everywhere. So you have to devote a lot of your processing resources to things like multi-sample anti-aliasing. One thing that my team has done to sort of deal with these problems is we wrote our own custom engine. And that's all in C++, and that gives us really tight control over memory management. There's a lot of, well, I shouldn't say a lot, there's 2 engines that everyone uses, Unity and Unreal, and they're great. And but the problem is they have not been developed in an ecosystem of VR with the particular constraints we have with VR. So it can be hard to eke out all the processing in my experience. So we're relying on some creative hacks to make the most of our games. One thing that we did to get the most performance out is we invented this thing we call hybrid scopic vision. And really, you want to double draw everything in your game for that nice stereoscopic effect. But after about 8 meters out, the effect really falls off because the verts are virtually co-located beyond that. So we single draw everything beyond 8 meters and we still get that nice stereo in the foreground, and your brain just fills in the rest and thinks it's stereo beyond that. So you have to get kind of creative. Another thing we'll do is we'll cull the content that we're drawing to reduce geometry costs. And people typically use a frustum when they're doing this in typical game design and development, which is a pyramid shape with its head cut off, and they use that because it maps really well to a screen being your TV or your PC or your phone. But the thing is, in VR, you really, even though you're probably drawing the pixels on a rectangular screen, because of the lenses that you're working with, it's mostly just circles. So you can think about, instead of using a screen, if you use a cone instead of that frustum shape, you can actually aggressively cull even more. So in VR, if you can just sort of re-examine some of your fundamental assumptions that you're bringing from PC and console development or student development, you can get away with a lot more. And another thing that we do is occlusion boxes, and we're really looking back to some of the old school retro tricks from things like Doom, where they did ESP trees to reduce the things that they are tasked to draw. So for example, if something is existing in a box that is occluded by a box other than its own, then we don't draw it. So these are some of the hardware constraints that you're dealing with on the VR side, but there are other constraints as well. If you're making a really good game, you want to have a beta test, you want to do an early access just to vet that content against the community, against a lot of eyeballs, especially if you're like me at an indie studio or working at a smaller scale where you don't have a huge QA department at your disposal. But there's a problem in that VR is pretty new, and there are limited headsets in the wild. So in the last year, yeah, that's where I was going with this. In the last year, most of the headsets out there have been development kits, and those have been not out in huge numbers. So one way you can deal with that, even though the headsets have, just shipped the Vive, we just shipped the Oculus Rift, and Gear is out. We're getting more headsets out there, but to deal with this in the meantime, I encourage anyone here who's doing VR testing to sort of guerrilla Kleenex test people that they hang around with. If you're at a conference, like things like today, I saw people showing their games. That's the best thing you can do. And you want to do Kleenex testing because if you're not familiar with that metaphor, it's like your Kleenex tester hasn't been used up before. They're not exposed to your content already. So you get the most parallel experience you're going to have with your first time user. And another thing you want to do if you are doing these Kleenex tests is you really want to, in VR more than any other type of game development, you really want to flesh out your tutorial in advance. And that's because, in my experience, people don't like being talked to when they're in VR with a headset. And I think that might have to do with the fact that they can't see your mouth when you're talking. And they really can't tell if you're talking to them. So if you're running multiple tests and they hear your voice, I think people kind of don't want to look stupid by responding to you if they're not sure you are directing the question at them. So if you have a fleshed out tutorial, you're going to get a lot more of that playtest, get a lot more out of it. And I'm not talking about tutorials like Clippy, like hit it over your head, here's what you do next. You can cleverly design some implicit tutorials into your game. So one thing I did is in my main menu, I have buttons, and this is a gaze-based game. So you click on a button by looking at it. In this main menu, you'll have sub-menus which are presented by modal sort of dialog boxes. You're looking at one button in front of you. If you click on it, you'll have the sub-menu appear off to the side. And you actually have to turn your head to look at it. And what that does is two things. One is it starts tutorializing the fact that you're going to be turning your head in VR. Because people, you would think they know that, but they don't. And the other thing is, you don't run the risk of them accidentally clicking on a button that spawns where they were looking, which is kind of a big deal. So as you're having these play tests that you do to get feedback on your game, a big limiting thing is you can't necessarily see what your playtester is looking at and where they're at in the game. So you really want to design your audio so that you can hear where they're at. Ideally, you could stream the content if you're on mobile VR, but right now we're just not there tech-wise to have the content stream without dipping their frame rate and making that experience a little worse for them. So design that audio, and the main reason for this is, again, people don't want to look stupid. I've gone to conferences where there's a lot of people playing the game, and you'll get someone coming in and they'll play for like 5 minutes, they'll go through all the same motions everyone else did, so you think they've progressed pretty far. I remember one guy took the headset off, gave it back to me, he had never left the main menu. But he didn't want to look like stupid, and I don't think the thing is, if someone doesn't leave the main menu because they don't know how to interact with it, that's my fault. But not everyone knows that, and they think it's their fault, and they don't want to look like an idiot. So if you just design that audio so you can tell if they're still in the main menu, that will get you pretty far. So of course you want to blow people away with your VR experience, and it can be really tempting to try to play to the strengths of VR. What can you do in VR that you can't do on console or PC or mobile? But I think if you try to design exclusively for the medium, that can lead you down some unfortunate rabbit holes. So if you're talking about mobile VR, this can be tetherless, which can be really great. And I designed my game where you are looking all around you, to the side, up and down and back, because I thought, what a great opportunity I have as a game developer to take advantage of that space. But actually, people really just want to sit and look straight ahead. They have been trained that by their TV, by their computer, by dealing with other people. Usually people are in one static location. So I had to go back to the community and listen to this feedback and patch and controller support to let people just look straight ahead. Another thing that I did is I thought about, okay, VR is a stereoscopic experience. But what if you had a monoscopic moment in that stereoscopic experience? We could do that in the real world because we have things like kaleidoscopes and telescopes. So I decided to put a telescope in my VR game, and when you use it, you really close one eye, and if you do, you can see through that. And you can see through this magical stained glass and get items on the other side. And it's really cool. But it's kind of this gimmicky thing. And I was doing it just because I could, and just because I was sort of thinking about this would be so neat. It doesn't necessarily add a ton of fun to the game. One more example is that in VR you have accelerometer data, so you have access to yaw, pitch, and roll movement of the head to see where the orientation of your player's head is. So I designed an input system rather than around traditional buttons, yes or no. I had nodding your head and shaking your head as a way to accept or reject quests and interact with tutorials. The problem is what I thought was pretty standard for a nod is not standard at all. I've learned through playtests. There's so many different things. You get the swoop, which is a thing, I guess. You get this like kind of staccato thing. And then also I learned that there are some cultural differences around an affirmative nod, which in some cultures, I guess, is more like this. So if I'm going to use my code, get my code to capture all of these different nods, you end up getting a lot of false positives. So I actually took this system out of my game. The problem is right now VR R&D is so expensive that I'm seeing a lot of people copying each other's mechanics. So even though I've taken this out of my games, I'm seeing it in other people's games who will say, oh, I love that system, and I put it in mine too. The problem is there's a lot of community regurgitation going on right now, and because you don't have this early access, because you don't have the, yeah, sorry. I procrastinate by making slide images. Way too much fun with it. You get this community of developers regurgitating mechanics that don't get properly vetted through the community and through users. The market's not quite there yet. And because the market's not there, you're also not getting AAA injections of content. So the VR space right now is almost entirely indie that's just starting to change. AAAs are just starting to dip their toes in the water. But that is resulting in a community or breadth of content that's kind of scrappy. And another thing that's amplifying this sort of scrappy breadth of content is the kind of people who are doing VR design and development right now. myself included, we are inherently tinkerers, we're experimenters, we're not necessarily people who are excited about restraint and minimalism. And so we're not necessarily getting to those really elegant designs. But that's okay, because again, all of the ideas that we're coming up with right now are going to be the pool of content that are the standards in the next generation. So this is just one more like kind of gimmicky thing I've done in one of my games where this monkey jumps on you from the laundry lines. And I thought, okay, how cool would it be to have, when the monkey jumps on you, it's on your head. And you get the haptic feedback, and there's really a hand on each eye. And it's really stupid, but it's kind of awesome, but it's pretty stupid. You shake your head, the monkey flies away. So if VR is this gimmick, if it's this fad, and it's really expensive to design for, what's the point? Why aren't we just designing content for proven platforms? I'm going to tell you about something that really changed my view about VR. I used to be a skeptic. I come from the PC console side of things. And I happen to have a fear of flying. So I know it's an irrational fear, and that doesn't change the fact that I have a very physiological response to it. I will break out in hives coming up to a flight. I have a hard time breathing. My heart just races out of my chest, and it really sucks. So I've done a lot of things to try to deal with this. I have a prescription for Xanax, which I don't really like taking, and I've listened to soothing music. And typically I'll bring a book on a flight or play a game and just try to distract myself. But it's really hard to forget about the fact that my body is catapulting 35,000 feet above the ground, completely untethered. And every dip and every blip and every hum of the engine will just send me thinking about this nosedive that I'm always completely confident that we're about to dip into. And so what I do is I stare out the window because I get very claustrophobic. And I'm just usually confronted with a seat back right in my eyes. I feel like I don't have a sense of agency. I have no control over what's going on, and I think that's really stressful. So recently, I tried taking VR on a flight. And I was not prepared for how much it helped me. I was able to see this expansive city in front of me instead of the seat back of 16A or whatever it was. I noticed my claustrophobia was gone. And the sound from the game was really canceling out the sound from the airplane. And the strategy of the game was occupying my attention. And it was a really immersive experience. But what was most remarkable to me was the fact that my hands, which are usually sweating bullets on a flight, were dry after an hour in VR. And I thought that's something you could actually measure concretely. And I got really excited about that, the power of VR. So typically, one of the ways people address phobias is they will do exposure therapy to show you the thing you're afraid of gradually. And I've heard about a lot of people working on this in VR, but what I'm kind of interested in is the exact opposite, something that will let you completely remove yourself from an experience. So when you're reading a book or you're playing on your iPhone on a flight, you have a distraction, but that sensory input that you're taking in is sharing context with the rest of the flight. So that's only representing a fraction of the photons hitting your retina, and the rest of them are all about the seats around you, the fact that you're on an airplane. In VR, it's different. You have an absolute retinal monopoly, so you can really control what you're visually experiencing. And that means you have the power to turn the world off. You can opt out of an experience in a way that I have never seen anyone be able to do before with existing technology. So I don't see this as just a tool to deal with phobia. I think it's also a huge opportunity to not only turn a world off, but also turn a different alternative world on. And I think there can be many applications for this, not just gaming. I'm excited about gaming, but I think there's going to be huge opportunities with just access, with education, with architecturally exploring your new house before you buy it, or figuring out what this building is going to look like before investing in building it, medical applications. There's going to be a lot of cool things. We think that we're going places because we trust our vision. And in your life today, your experience was that you were in bed this morning and then you walked here. and now you're here in this room with me. And you think that because that's what your eyes are telling you. But in VR, we're getting different information from our eyes. So regardless of your actual GPS corporeal location, VR is giving you the power to go other places. It's a personal transporter. And I know this sounds really grand and epic, and I do think that VR has huge potential. Just right now, we're kind of in the adolescence. We have a lot of enthusiasm. Sorry, oh my I like The Simpsons, okay? We have a lot of enthusiasm, and we don't have as much expertise because this is pretty new. We're just in this awkward but necessary stage of growth in this new medium. So I would say the first step in getting there is I want to challenge everyone here who's doing VR design to step back and think about what problem are you solving with your design. So, for example, I was at the Oculus campus, I was checking out a VR demo, and it was so immersive and so compelling, I wanted to walk forward and explore the world, but I bumped into a coffee table, because I wasn't supposed to be walking. So I thought about that, and that's why I designed my first game around a flying carpet experience. You are delivering the contract to the player that they're going to get to explore the world, but it also teaches the player to plant their feet in one place and not destroy their household while they're playing VR. And once you start solving these problems, you can really let a lot of your other mechanics and design choices fall out of those solutions. So if I'm on a flying carpet, what does the world look like? I ended up making sort of like ancient Turkish, sort of surrealistic world. And you have a lot of variables that you have to solve in VR because you have a loss of abstraction. So if you think about the first games on the computer, like Minesweeper and Pong, those were very symbolic. They were very abstract. They were circles and squares. But in VR, you're typically in first person, and that has a lot of implications. For example, you're going to have perspective to deal with. You're going to have to decide what the sky looks like. Because if your player looks up, you have to draw something there. So there's just a lot more variables that you have to tackle as a designer. And if you don't tackle them cleanly, you'll get a mess. So because of this, I think you get kind of this forced relative realism. And I'm not talking necessarily about an aesthetic realism, but more a one-to-one relationship between the player and the game. So for example, if your player looks at a reflective surface in the game, you have to figure out what's reflecting back at them. You have to draw the avatar and design what it looks like. In Minesweeper, what did the sky look like? What did the avatar look like? They didn't have to solve those problems. So again, if you don't solve them cleanly, it can be cacophonous. So I ended up, bringing in this Turkish lantern shop that I had visited, bringing a lot of the shapes and colors into my VR design because of the flying carpet. So it helped me solve my aesthetic. So the flying carpet was kind of a superpower. And in VR, just like with other video games, it can be tempting to grant a lot of different superpowers to your players, but you want to be very judicious and use these cleanly, otherwise it'll just be completely confusing. I saw a really great example of this with another developer named Daniel Spore, who did this Audi showcase. It wasn't a game. But the problem was he was doing a Vive experience at room scale. The room is 6 by 6. He has to show a car that people can walk around. How can you fit a car within a 6 by 6 space that people can walk around? What he did was he granted the users a superpower. He gave them motion gain. So for every step they took, they went double the distance that they would normally take. That's how he solved the problem and delivered this great user experience. So again, just as a challenge to you, don't think about what can I do that would be so cool in VR. Think about the problems and try to solve them, because there's still plenty of problems to solve. And that will help with reducing some of the clutter. The cost of having all of this clutter is if you're at a website or you're in a video game and it's a loud and cluttered experience, you can look away. But in VR, you don't have that visual relief. If you look to the side, you're still in that experience. People will just take the headset off, and they might not put it back on. So it's a really big cost that can screw over other developers, not just yourself. Another way to keep your experience more clean is rely less on visual tutorials, but more on multiplayer tutorials. So this is a prototype I was working on where I was pushing that social experience, and you can do a lot of tricks to bring that along. So one thing you definitely want to do is first-person camera, human scale, just to start establishing presence. And presence is this super buzzword in VR right now. And what you also want to do is have representative avatars. So right now, we're starting to get the technology to do body scans and digitalize them, but people don't have access to this at a large scale. So one thing you can do is just borrow from Facebook and Twitter and just use photos, and that can help you identify the other people in VR. Stop laughing. And you know, another thing you can do to foster that social experience is really show where people are looking. So you can you can allow people to see the line of sight of other players. You can plump the content other players are looking at. And that really fosters patience in a multiplayer game. So if they have a strategy or a tactical decision they're making that's taking them a long time, you can both learn from their strategy by seeing exactly the decision-making process they're going through, and you can also be patient as you're watching them, their nonverbal communications with their gestures, their head orientations. And lastly, you just want to spatialize your sound if you're doing this social VR. You know, VR is this weird thing because you have a visual experience that is not matching up necessarily with what your vestibular system is detecting, and that can be really uncomfortable. So anything you can do to sort of line these up more is going to help quite a bit. But if you don't have a multiplayer experience, there's just a couple more tricks I want to talk you through to keep the tutorialization and the game clean. So I mentioned the importance of seeing what other people are looking at in your experience. That's not just for multiplayer, that's also for single player. So you really oftentimes want to show people like a reticle or something that will let them see exactly where they're looking in the game. And there's a problem with this. I'll do a little experiment if you guys are up for it, where if you have, I have a whole slide for this. It's pretty exciting. Okay, so if you imagine your reticle, which is like your binoculars or scope or whatever, and you're looking through it, you can follow along with me. And then you have your target of what you're trying to look at in your other hand. This is your target hand, this is your reticle hand. If you have one eye shut, you can see your target clearly here, right? If you open both eyes, your target gets kind of doubled because you have two eyes. The problem is, in VR, people typically have two eyes open. So how do you resolve that? How do you make the target clear while also drawing a reticle that will help them understand what they're looking at? If you move your reticle to the depth that your target is at, now you'll notice, even with both eyes open, your target is in focus here. So what you end up wanting to do is you draw your target literally on screen at depth of what you're looking at. So this is a city that you're moving through. So if you can imagine, as you're scanning along the topography of the buildings, what's actually happening is that target is moving, well, like basically in and out, in and out. And what that results in is a reticle that's scaling, and that's weird to look at. So if you dynamically scale the reticle, you give the effect that it's in between the target and your eyes, while it's actually not, so that they're both in focus. So I super geek out about these tricks because I studied vision science and my degree's in psychology. I really recommend a book called Photons to Phenomenology for anyone who is interested in vision science and VR. I get tons of tricks and ideas out of that. And one final recommendation to reduce clutter is to think about having a really simplistic input scheme in VR. Right now, there's lots of different input schemes between the game pads and the wands and touch controllers and your keyboard. If you do things just like gaze only, you can both have a more intuitive experience, and you can also have a platform agnostic experience that will let you port on multiple platforms if you're trying to make money. That helps. But if you do this, you typically have a timer. And when the timer ticks around, you've selected something. And that can be kind of a sloshy experience, like driving an automatic. You might want that juicy click experience that people are used to. So again, with making all these design decisions, you want to weigh the costs and the benefits. And just like everything I've talked to you about today, the point of this is not to say don't be experimental, don't go and do novel tricks. It's just to return to solving the problems because that's going to result in a better VR experience. I don't mean to be too down on all the new stuff, but I think that once we develop a bunch of the features that we're using now, those are going to translate into the pool of content that will become the standards for the next generation, and that's how we'll clean it up. And you guys hopefully will be a big part of that.
I was just wondering if you deal with like the simulation fatigue at all, and how you do that.
Right now, I think that keeping a game at 30 minutes or less is kind of a good standard, and hopefully that changes, you know, as tech moves along. But I have a friend who's going through a marathon where he has decided to spend 100 hours in VR straight, and there's a reason that's a big deal. You know, I don't think it's quite there yet. Yeah.
There's no line. Question station now. I'm sorry.
I think there was one in the back.
Yeah. How do you think Bazaar would have been different if you designed it with hand controllers from the start? And do you think there are going to be games, VR games in the future without hand controller support once the headsets come out and the controllers come out?
In the future, without, well, I think, you know, in the future, I don't know where it's going to go. We'll probably be wearing like entire outfits that have sensors everywhere, because right now, you know, really have access only to the head orientation, and then if you have touch controllers with the 5 wands, you have that hand information. The more that people design for a unique input system, the more they're cutting down their market. And so I think it's pretty tricky right now. Yeah, I'm not sure. Does that answer some of your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to go back to Ruth's talk, and she started with mentioning the VR experience Osmos by Sean Davies. And having done that, there was something that reinforced your corporality, which she mentioned, is that you control your movement through breath. And so it reinforced your experience of your own body. And you kind of felt a sense of gravity or lightness. And in that way, I think it was a true breakthrough, especially against the hype of, say, Jeremy Lemire, would you like to be an octopus in Designer Kitchen? So my question is that there's a variety of technologies, like, you know, Tobii, eye tracking, and Leap, we all thought was going to be Minority Report. And some of these do engage your very sense of presence and corporality. So is there not always, when you put such an emphasis on vision, and vision only, always going to be this tension between our embodiment and versus simply the in-your-face 360 world that you can hold your head around it?
Yeah, I think that is certainly the case right now. There is quite a bit of tension between your visual experience and VR, because that's most VR sensory experience is purely just visual. There's a little bit of complementary with haptics and things like that. And I think I'm seeing technology slowly, well, not slowly, I mean it's rapid, but I'm seeing us get there. I'm seeing people come up with, just recently I saw that you could electrically stimulate your vestibular system, and it sounds like totally black box to me. I'm not exactly sure how it works, but apparently it has a big effect on helping you digest this and not have that conflicting experience. From my studies in psychology, I know that we have sort of a priority we give our eyeballs, you know, when you have conflicting sensory input, and I think that's exactly what VR is exploiting. Yeah, but I would love to see more stuff that complements that experience, so there's less discord.
And there was a point you made about your experience in an airplane, and you mentioned the word agency.
Mm-hmm.
So VR potentially gives you agency, but that sense of agency, perhaps it points to a different aesthetic. And I'll just cite one example, which is the Reese Witherspoon movie that, you know, they showed at Sundance, Wild, where you could follow Reese Witherspoon. And I heard the sound designer at GDC talk about how they had to motivate when she began a dialogue with her mother. And they used, it was the same problem that you mentioned about how do you direct and get people to turn their heads. So it was about the sound of rustling of, some pine trees, which didn't cause whiplash, but redirecting your attention. So that's about being there, in a sense, again, of your embodiment. And does that not point to a very different aesthetic than, say, the last 40 years of video games?
Yeah, I think an example of sound design trying to capture and manipulate your attention is similar to a lot of the visual tricks. It's one more tool that the designers have access to. But again, I think there are a lot of risks because, well, just like with that cis-trait issue, if one person, or one problem gets solved by having one of these things that's competing for your attention, you're probably not just going to have one problem, you're probably going to have more and more problems, and if you've gotten used to solving them with a rustling in the trees or a shooting star over here, eventually you just get the stimuli that totally compete with each other and create a messy experience. I'm not sure how to solve this problem. Again, I think standards are going to be the thing that help it along, but I'm not sure on the cinematic side with the Reese Witherspoon experience. I haven't seen that. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that your team made your own engine from the ground up for this, but then also VR, of course, has really high R&D costs, and so there's making your own engine. So kind of like in postmortem, would you recommend more people take the make your own engine approach if you have the talent, or would you come to another conclusion?
God, that's a really tough one. We've been working on this engine outside of VR for 6 years. It's something that it's great because it's multi-platform development. We don't have to port separate games. We can develop concurrently for all the headsets. But it's something, because we have such tight control over it, we can pivot it to VR very nimbly. I don't know that I would recommend it for everyone because it's a big undertaking. And I think coming up in the next few years, you guys are going to be graduated in industry or wherever you end up, and probably if VR really does take off, the next thing, these other engines will, by that time, have caught up a bit more. But they have clients right now that they're trying to satisfy that are not necessarily coming from VR. So I think it just if they're in that space that's satisfying all of video games, it's just going to take a little bit longer to optimize for VR.
So you mentioned the example earlier of you coming up with this new system that being caught on even after you'd already sort of removed the system from your own work.
Yeah.
So how do you kind of try to strike a balance between the need for experimentation for new systems and the need for standardization? How do you see conventions actually beginning to develop in this medium?
Well, I think fortunately, these headsets are shipping now, and so you're going to get bigger teams who are trying to make money off of the market that's just starting to crystallize. So hopefully, this is a problem that just gets less and less and less because you'll start getting consumer dollars, you'll start getting AAA input. So I see it being something that's more of a problem of just being on the cutting edge of it. Yeah. Yes, in the back.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Temple Gates Games?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So Temple Gates Games is a company of 5 people. We're small. We're in San Francisco. And it's comprised of me and 2 other people who worked on Spore with me at Maxis. The guy who made Plants vs. Zombies, Todd Semple, and B. Roseshi, who came over from Zynga. And we are all game jam junkies. That's the thing, do game jams. They're super fun, but they're also a great opportunity to get an artificially high audience, especially if you do things like Ludum Dare. And you have a chance to vet an idea that you might not be able to spend the time sort of indulging in other times. So we do lots of game jams. We did a game jam together where we all just worked really well together, and we were kind of between our other projects and we formed a company. So we're pretty new as a company, but we've all been friends for a really long time. So doing business in the Bay Area, doing video games, it's really taught me just, you know, keep your friendships, keep your relationships, because those are going to be the people that you end up forming companies with. So you should all keep in touch with each other too, because I'm sure that will happen for you. Mm-hmm.
So, I remember the question from earlier. Yes. So, what prospects would you find most interesting in the future for non-first-person VR games? 'Cause I know there's some talks, I know that, I can't recall the name, that platformer that's sort of over the shoulder, you can follow along third person. So there's some games experimenting that, but where do you see the most interesting, the most feasible way to do non-first-person VR stuff?
I mean, I think third person is a good place to start, and I'm seeing some cool stuff there. I don't know. It's hard not to want to take advantage of that first person opportunity in VR, because it can be really magical. And I think a lot of games that you can do in third person make plenty of sense for PC or console. So I'm excited to see how that changes. I'm sure somebody's going to totally change my mind on it and prove me wrong, and hopefully that happens soon. Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned the standardizations with the headsets coming out and AAA like just starting to get on board. There's a lot of the experimentations, like you said. Also, is there a threat that some of the bad mechanics are going to become standard? Like when AAA picks it up and people start like not really caring, just like want to get apps out there.
Yeah, I definitely hear the like fear of the freemium model, and I think that right now VR has been a weird sort of luxury industry to be in, just because of the limited market. So you do have this sort of utopia of people who really just care about doing really cool things, and it's not all about extracting dollars from their whales. That's going to change. You know, now that the headsets are out there, there's definitely going to be more of the evil megacorp mentality. Hopefully, there's just enough of us on the good side, you know. And by the way, I don't think that AAA gets a fair rap. Like, I think there's a lot of really passionate people in AAA that are not all about just extracting dollars, but there is that coming from sometimes the finance side, when you have a huge multi-million-dollar budgets that you have to account for and stuff. Mm-hmm.
In regards to sound, especially, we're seeing that the next gen thing has to consider integrating headphones and integrating sound localization in the SDKs, so that you don't have to do the work twice, saying the object over there is taking your sound from over there, and it's done by ears directly.
Yeah.
Is that something that people are actively pursuing? It seems like that's really, to my mind, it's a critical thing that needs to be put in place for the problems you mentioned earlier about, you know, stimulation and so forth. Is that in the cards anywhere? Is somebody actually looking at that as an extra
Yeah, I know that the consumer evolution of the Oculus Rift has the headphones built in. They do have a sound solution. So just like you said, every developer doesn't have to reinvent the wheel as far as making that spatialized audio experience. I'm not a total audiophile, so I'm sure I'm not on the front edge of all of this stuff, but I do see the SDKs and the APIs that are supporting developers, not just with sound, but also with gesture and things like that, to just sort of, you know, be more efficient, let all the developers focus on game mechanics, while some of these things that, like you already have the Oculus or the Vive SDKs that manage the stereo, the same thing is starting to get fleshed out for sound. Okay, one more question. Yes?
You mentioned earlier about how VR has been used for like exposure therapy and stuff like that. Do you see it, like VR growing more like non-gaming use?
Yeah, I really think that VR is going to be so much more than games. I think it's going to have a huge impact, again, on access, what people can get to education-wise, and, you know, just going places. But I think the thing is, right now, the skill sets of game developers maps really well to what it takes to make a VR application, and it's really obvious how to make a VR game, you know, relative to make a VR anything else, basically. So I feel that way about AR. I totally think AR is the future, but VR is the future right now, and games are right now the obvious thing to do.